My name is Ben Side. I'm at the University of Kent and I'm one of the conveners of the um, PSA's political psychology group. Welcome to the second of our online research seminars. Delighted to have with us Katharina Lawall, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for the Politics of Feelings at the University of London and Royal Holloway, and works in the field broadly of political behaviour and political psychology, and is going to talk to us today about losing elections and the impact of losing elections on people's anti-democratic attitudes. A very topical issue. And Katharina is going to talk for 20-25 minutes. We will then have half an hour or a little over for questions. So hope it's all very straightforward. Any questions before we get going? Anyone? No? Good. Okay, well, Katharina, it's lovely to have you. Thank you for coming along today and giving us this talk. The electronic floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everyone for being here today. Let me just share my screen with you. Great. Can you see that all in full screen mode?
We can. That's lovely.
Perfect. And just checking back and forth is fine.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. So again, thank you so much, Ben, for having me here today, and thank you all for coming. My name is Katharina Lawall. I'm currently doing a postdoc at the Centre for the Politics of Feelings. Very excited to present joint work with Katharina Michalaki and Manos Zakiris, who are also at the centre. Now, this research project was very much inspired by the observation that increasingly we're seeing these very extreme sort of forms of partisan polarization taking root in democracies across the globe, particularly, I think, point in case is the US, but also in other countries. On the left, you can see an image from the Capitol attacks in January 2021, where a group of protesters violently stormed the US Capitol building. And of course, you might say, well, this is still an isolated incident, but there's also more and more academic research showing that American partisans in particular show a kind of growing tendency to be more comfortable with political violence in order to advance their goals. And I think particularly prominent piece of work here is Nathan Calmo and Liliana Mason's book, Radical American Partisanship, where they show that even though the sort of number of people supporting political violence is still small, generally that number is growing in the US with very worrying consequences for democracy, because the support for political violence and kind of what it entails really goes to like the core kind of against fundamental democratic principles, such as peaceful transfers of power, non-violent political interactions. And so understanding what drives these extreme forms really of partisan polarization is important. And this is really where this research project comes in. The main thing that we're trying to understand is why, when do partisans adopt these what we call anti-democratic attitudes? And with that, I mean support for political violence and also support for democratic norm breaking, such as your own in-party giving out executive orders instead of kind of passing laws in a regular format, being more comfortable with going after journalists if they publish a news story that makes your own in-party look bad, etc. And the particular kind of mechanism that we investigate in this paper is what happens when partisans feel challenged, threatened in their identity. And we argue that this is particularly salient when partisans lose an election, right? They might feel more threatened in terms of who they are. And this can elicit these really strong negative emotional reactions, such as feeling angry, upset, disgusted at an electoral loss. And we look at whether these kind of negative partisan emotions, catalyzed by identity-threatening events, such as losing an election, increase support for political violence and democratic norm breaking. And just to preview really briefly what we do in this paper is we conducted a pre-registered survey experiment around the US midterm elections that took place last November. And we randomly assigned both Republican and Democrat partisans in the US, a sample of around 700 individuals, to either a placebo, an electoral loss prime referencing in-group anger at the election outcome, or an electoral loss prime referencing in-group anxiety or worry at the election outcome. And then we record after this, participants have reported support for political violence and democratic norms. And the first kind of preview kind of result I want to share with you is that these treatments were actually quite effective. So even in a context of like a real salient election loss that's covered in the news, our treatments managed to inform participants that they actually lost the election, so increased perceptions that their own in-party lost, and they also made people feel worse about the election outcome. But despite that, we actually don't find, contrary to our pre-registered expectations, any effects of these electoral loss treatments compared to the placebo on support for democratic norms or political violence. And I would say overall, this kind of may like challenge our thinking in terms of how much these effective polarization or emotional pathways contribute to these really extreme forms of partisan polarization, such as supporting political violence. But let me give you a bit more theoretical background first. So first of all, there's already quite a large literature on polarization and kind of democratic backsliding or support for democratic norms. And what that literature shows is that overall polarization, whether effective or otherwise, seems to be associated with a lower support for democratic norms. The more polarized people get, the more likely they're kind of happy to sort of throw away some quite important fundamental democratic principles in order to defend their in-group. However, more recent experimental research in particular has called into question whether there's really a causal relationship between outgroup animosity and this erosion of democratic norms. So when we actually try to induce higher effective polarization in individuals, this has not been shown to affect any of these kind of political outcome variables, including support for democratic norms. And similarly, studies that try to prime, for instance, negative partisanship, don't find that this affects causally support for democratic norms. And there's other research that's kind of critiqued studies on political violence that is generally kind of overstated, and that support for political violence is still generally low among the American electorate. And so kind of against this backdrop of, I would say, conflicting until now still empirical evidence, what our study adds is really trying to, in a kind of careful experimental design, contribute to this question of how negative feelings that kind of a very salient identity threatening event may or may not cause increases in support for political violence and democratic norm breaking. And why this particular angle? Well, I think very often when we study effective polarization, for instance, the kind of intuitive underlying assumption is it's something about our feelings, right? When we as partisans lose an election, it's not just a kind of instrumental loss of power for a few years. It feels personal. Your side has lost an election, and it feels like a personal loss to partisans, engendering really strong negative emotional reactions, such as anger, maybe feeling anxious or worried about what's to come if the other side has more power, but also feeling threatened in the core of kind of who you are as a person. And that's why we think these kind of negative partisan emotions might be particularly important in understanding how these polarization processes relate to these extreme sort of outgrowths of polarization, such as support for political violence and democratic norms. So our pre-registered hypotheses are that priming negative partisan emotions that occur as a result of an electoral loss, such as anger and anxiety in this case, would lead to higher support for political violence and lower support for democratic norms. The way that we test this is we conducted a pre-registered survey experiment that we conducted during the last US midterm elections. just to refresh your memory, what happened during the last US midterms is there was a split result, meaning the Democrats won the Senate and the Republicans won the House of Representatives. It was generally quite a tight election, right? And I think more so the Republicans were forecast to do slightly better than they did, but generally it was quite a tight race. Why is this an ideal setting for this experiment? We are able to symmetrically prime feelings of electoral loss among both Democrats and Republicans, because both sides lost one of the races, one of the institutions that were up for grabs in this US midterm election. And I think that's exciting and adds new evidence to research that we already have on this question, because previous studies have either been able to prime electoral loss, let's say, for instance, during a presidential election where there's one clear winner or loser in one group of partisans, right? Or symmetrically among all partisan groups, but with a hypothetical election scenario where you get people to imagine that they either win or lose the next upcoming election. Of course, maybe imagining in a hypothetical scenario might not be as hard-hitting as actually losing a real election that has just passed. And so I think this paper is also really trying to add some sort of unique empirical evidence that combines a real salient election loss occurring on both sides with an experimental prime. Our sample are Republican and Democrat partisans in the US, around 700, that we recruited on prolific academic and academic recruitment platform in the US that also operates in other countries. Let me show you what this design looked like in practice. I think one of the most important features of our design is that we employ a pre-to-post design, meaning we recruit our participants to a baseline survey that took place before the US midterm elections, and we then embed an experiment in the Wave 2 survey that occurred after the election. That allows us to look at changes from Wave 1 to Wave 2 as our main dependent variable, and that's really important in terms of kind of power. With 700 participants, even though that number may seem smaller, we're still able to detect treatment effects of around 0.2 or 5 to 6 percentage points in this group of individuals. So what happened in Wave 2 is we randomly assigned individuals to one of 3 experimental conditions: a placebo, an anger electoral loss prime, or a worry electoral loss prime. And the main way that we were able to deliver these treatment primes was through a newspaper article that we created, plus some follow-up questions, including an open text question. And you can see here that for the placebo, this was the same for Democrat and Republican respondents. It's quite a boring, validated placebo article about a licensing policy delivered in a neutral tone. For the Democrats always read about their respective electoral loss in regards to the Republican House win, whereas Republicans always read about the Democratic Senate win. And at that point in time, this was like kind of widely publicly available news. It was reported in all major news outlets that this was the kind of outcome of the US midterm election at that time point. The thing we additionally varied in the electoral loss primes was the kind of in-group emotion primed in the news story. This was delivered in the headline, but also further down in the text. I don't want to kind of show you this too long, but just to let you know that within the text, we really tried to keep the text really sort of similar across the different treatment arms, and both in terms of the length and the actual content of the text. So what happened after this newspaper article? People answered a couple of questions, including an open text question. where we asked them how they felt about the newspaper article. And here, using kind of dictionary and supervised learning methods, we see that, as expected, people who read about the electoral loss use much more negative language in this open text question, which was the goal of that kind of additional treatment manipulation, was really for people to kind of actively emotionally engage with the content of that news article. Then everyone gets a question about what the outcome of the election was and how they felt about it. Everyone engages in a filler task, and then we measure our main outcomes. Our main outcomes are support for political violence. This is a standard political violence battery used by Carmel Mason, for instance. And it's really sort of some very generic questions about people's sort of general willingness, comfortableness with using political violence. So it's about, would you be okay for your in-group to send threatening and intimidating messages to out-party leaders? Is it okay for an ordinary in-partisan to harass an out-partisan on the internet? Is it ever justified for in-partisans to use violence to advance their political goals, etc.? Democratic norms, we also use a standard battery used in the literature. And these are kind of various like democratic norm transgressions, such as kind of setting the boundaries for Congress in a way that maximizes the number of your in-partisans elected. When a journalist accuses a politician of misconduct, should the journalist be criminally investigated? Should we reduce the number of polling stations in an area that typically support the out party? So before I show you the main results, I just want to convince you a bit that these treatments were effective. So what you can see here is that for both Democratic and Republican respondents, going from the placebo condition in gray to either of the treatments in color really increases the proportion of respondents who are willing to say that their party lost the respective US midterm election. And so for Democrats, this is kind of almost like a 25 percentage point increase, and for Republicans, around a 30 percentage point increase. We also asked everyone how they feel about that election outcome. And here on the emotions circled in gray at the top, that we tried to particularly prime in a newspaper article, angry and worried, we also see that the treatments compared to the placebo with 95% confidence intervals significantly increase respondents' self-reported feelings of anger and worry at the election outcome. But if you go further down, you also see that participants in the treatment conditions say they're more disappointed, more disgusted, less proud, less enthusiastic, and less hopeful when they think about the election outcome. So just to show you that I think our treatments really did lead respondents to kind of engage with those negative feelings and led respondents in the electoral loss primes to feel more negative about the election outcome. But despite that, we don't find any effects on support for political violence. At the top, you can see our pre-registered outcome measure, the political violence index, which is an index measure combining all of the political violence items. But it also doesn't matter if we look at the individual ones. These are kind of consistently null effects. And again, we're looking at the pre to post change measure here, which is what we pre-registered. Similarly, for democratic norms, these effects are a bit noisier because we only have post-treatment measures for these, unfortunately. But again, if you look at our pre-registered outcome measure, the democratic norms index, this is also quite clearly kind of null effects. But, and this is not pre-registered, but exploratory, but I still wanted to sort of show you this. You might ask, well, could it be that these treatments just kind of washed out by the time that participants got to these outcome questions? I don't think that's the case. What you can see here is what our treatments do to respondents' levels of effective polarization as measured with these kind of standard thermometer score items. So where people place on a scale from 0 to 100, how warmly they feel towards out-partisan voters and in-partisan voters. We then take that gap between the in-group and the out-group and look at the change from wave 1 to wave 2. And what you can see here is that the electoral loss worry prime in particular slightly increases respondents' level of effective polarization towards voters. And intuitively, I think that makes sense, right? If you prime people about a sort of recent electoral loss, and they then feel more negative about the election, they may also feel more distant or less warmly towards out-party voters. So in conclusion, what have I shown you today? Results from a pre-registered survey experiment conducted during the last US midterms, where we tried to prime in both Republican and Democrat respondents kind of negative feelings about losing the US midterm elections. And what we show is that these electoral loss primes do not seem to significantly increase support for political violence or democratic norm breaking. However, the electoral loss primes did seem to, in an exploratory way, increase effective polarization towards voters, suggesting that, these kind of outbursts of negative feelings at electoral loss may kind of temporarily turn up the heat on politics. But in some ways, this could also be seen as good news, right? What this study shows is that kind of making partisans momentarily feel more negative about an election outcome is not enough to compel them to kind of abandon their fundamental democratic principles and turn to support political violence or kind of abandon fundamental democratic norms. Of course, we don't know how this would work if we expose people multiple times, like a higher treatment intensity, to negative emotions. And it could also just be that political violence and democratic norm breaking are better explained through different mechanisms other than kind of effective polarization and negative partisan emotions. So these are kind of two things that I'd be really kind of keen to work on in the future as a follow-up. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm really happy to have any comments or questions on this. And I also just want to say I'm really grateful to our funder, the Nomus Foundation, for funding this research. And if you'd like to learn more about the Center for the Politics of Feelings and what we do, feel free to visit our website, and we're also active on social media. So yeah, thanks so much. Looking forward to your questions.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Katharina. That was a wonderful presentation, perfectly to time, very interesting, and with a reassuring conclusion to boot. So all round great. Thank you very much for that. So we've got 35 minutes now for questions and comments. So Jack, I can see you got your hand up, so go ahead.
Thanks very much. Hopefully, can you hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great.
We can.
Thanks, Katharina. Really interesting. And I think definitely good news if we take your survey results, right? How people can't be driven to political violence just by reading a news article, because the worrying thing is that often it seems incredibly easy to get people to say that they'd be driven to this. I had a question about your treatment. I was wondering whether you had anything if pre-treatment you actually asked people whether they thought they'd lost the election. Because what I was thinking was this treatment where you tell both sides that they lost is likely to actually be slightly different to what they understand. So for example, Democrats might feel very happy that they slightly increased their hold of the Senate, right? And Republicans, on the other hand, could be very happy that they took the House and did well in gubernatorial races, right? And so I wondered, if the treatment actually, everything seemed to be working as you showed, but I wonder then if there is something there, a difference between people's expectations or understanding of what actually happened, and then your treatment telling them, well, something different might have actually happened. It's clear.
That's really. Thank you, Jack. Katharina, do you want to take a couple of questions, or do you want to respond to questions as they come in? Up to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a couple and then respond.
Okay, that's fine. Well, should we go to? So we've got three others. Let's take Dan, and then we'll go to Manu and Joe as a follow up.
Hi, Katharina, and also thanks to Ben and Jack for putting this on. Yeah, also great stuff. I had a sort of almost slightly dull question about whether there's kind of variation amongst respondents as well. So if you've looked at that, so I'm convinced the kind of average treatment is pretty null. I'm just wondering if there's like a subset of people that actually this did work on. That it doesn't surprise me necessarily that basically most people, like Jack said, aren't driven to political violence or whatever although it is surprisingly easy to do that, concerningly. But it might be that there's 5% of respondents that actually this does really wind them up, and they really are driven to sort of blood-curdling cries of revolution. Also, you have sample issues with doing that, but I think it might also be worth just seeing if the effect, if the coefficients are somewhere higher than you would necessarily expect them. There's a bunch of ways to do that. I think you can do it manually, or you can sort of automate it as well and just sort of look, given a bunch of covariates, are there any which particular combinations allow you to look at that. You may have already done it, but just an idea. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I'll take these two. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Jack and Dan, for those questions. So Jack, we actually asked in the kind of baseline survey what people expected the result of the election to be. And we find, we recruited partisans, right? We didn't recruit any independents, and people are very confident that their side is going to win both the House and the Senate when we asked them pre-treatment. So I hope that reassures you a bit that even if, of course, Democrats can say, well, we want the Senate, that's great. They might still have been a bit, at least our respondents might still have been a bit disappointed that they didn't, they did badly in the House election, although, of course, according to kind of polling experts, not as bad as they were projected to do. But I think if you're kind of identity motivated partisan, any loss can still feel kind of uncomfortable and threatening and can make you angry. So, but that's an excellent question, and we should really show those in the paper. So that's a very well taken point. In terms of the manipulation check question, we actually asked specifically about that particular kind of race that we're trying to prime on. So for Republicans, this is about the Senate election. Like, what was the outcome of the Senate elections? Did Republicans lose? And then almost 100% of our respondents respond correctly. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Dan, yeah, I think that would be great. We did have some like pre-registered hypotheses on this, which I think are unfortunately underpowered. To kind of like split it up further. I did check whether kind of pre-treatment negative partisanship, pre-treatment effective polarization, pre-treatment positive partisanship interacted all of these treatments. It doesn't seem to. So I'm not sure kind of in terms of theory driven, like looking for who this might be effective for. None of the kind of immediate ones would show that, but maybe looking in a less kind of theory-driven way would still be interesting. My hunch would be that it would be kind of raising it a little bit for people who are already quite predisposed to it, right? But yeah, I think most people in our sample would want to be good citizens and don't do this. Yeah, back to Ben. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Katharina. So I've got Manu and then Joe.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Jack and Ben for organising, and Katharina, that was a really great study and a great talk. Had two questions. One was about your outcome variable on support for political violence. I was perhaps just picking up on what you were just saying. People may not want to and genuinely may not feel that they could support it, but is there a way to also measure perhaps an indifference to it, or a willingness to look past it, or a refusal to condemn it? I mean, essentially all this kind of slightly more middle ground things where they're not out and out saying this is wrong, but they're just kind of maybe turning a blind eye. So I don't know if that's something that you could get from the variable that you have, or is that something perhaps for future work? And then a second one was on the open text question, because I like to include open text in my experiments as well. And I think there's sometimes some really nice hidden insights that you can get from it. So you mentioned that you'd looked at kind of negativity. So it sounds like you looked at kind of just overall sentiment, but did you drill into that anymore? And was there anything there that could tell you either about how this treatment was taken, perhaps about the null findings, or anything along that line?
Joe?
Yeah, hello. Wonderful paper, wonderful talk. Just one kind of half comment, half question about the effect or lack thereof of anger on support for democratic norms. One kind of paper this brings up for me in seeing that is Nicole Tausch et al.'s 2011 paper, where they separate anger and contempt, because anger often drives support for normative collective action, things that are very much within the democratic system, because there's a certain level of efficacy to the emotion. When you're angry, you believe that you can counteract the source of the anger. And they separate anger from contempt, which is basically anger without the hope that things will actually get better. And there you see support for political violence. Obviously, you can't rerun the 2022 election, but is there any sort of efficacy measure in the prolific survey that you did? Because perhaps an anger by efficacy interaction would be interesting to explore there, just to kind of tie into that work.
Katharina, do you want to answer those? And I'll come up to Rob and any others afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much. These are really great points. Thank you so much for those questions. I think for Manu's question, I think that's really that's a really interesting point. I kind of now wish we had given people a don't know option, but I think we didn't. So I think it's very difficult for me to like retrospectively now think about how we could maybe rescale the outcome variable to kind of tap into this kind of you don't want to comment on it, or instead of really condemning it. It's like a softer way of not distancing yourself from political violence. Although maybe I should say in kind of, defense of this measure, it's actually been criticized for overstating support for political violence by other research. So if anything, I think, with this measure, we should really find the effect rather than a more conservative measure. So we've really kind of used the kind of most generic measure that's widely used, but again has been criticized for maybe being a bit too lenient. Like it's too easy for people to say that they support political violence using this measure rather than other ones. So maybe that's something I should kind of mention more prominently in the paper, but a very good point. And then on the open text, yes, we ran like kind of normal sort of sentiment dictionaries, but we also were interested in this kind of anger versus fear-based language. So I started kind of looking into using some dictionaries, and I might do some more kind of supervised learning stuff with this as well, on showing that in the treatment conditions, when we ask people about how they feel about the newspaper article after they've been exposed to the electoral loss primes, people use more anger and fear-related language as well, which I think is really nice. So it's not just like overall, it's like more negative because it's an election. They also seem to be using these kind of particular like negative emotions in terms of the language that they use that we expect them to. I would say, there's also like definitely avenues for like more qualitative research using these open text responses, just kind of skimming them because there's not that many. I think some are kind of exactly what I expect. So quite derogatory language, use of swear words against the out group. And some are a little bit more complicated, right? So some are concerned about the policy impact of this in the future. And some may be negative, but not as strongly worded, right? Like some people are just a bit disappointed rather than really riled up and angry. And maybe that kind of difference in emotional intensity is difficult to pick up using just dictionary methods. But I think that's something that's definitely like interesting to do in the future. And then on Joe's question, I think that's a really great point on kind of anger with contempt or anger with hope. I'm definitely going to go read that paper. That's a very good suggestion. Maybe there's something in the open text as well that we could do with that. We do have like a wave 1 efficacy question. We didn't do anything in the wave 2 survey that was pre-treatment just because we didn't want to kind of, risk that interacts with the treatment in any way. But I think that's a really great idea. I haven't looked at that actually because it's not something we pre-registered, but that's a great point. So yeah, thank you so much for these suggestions.
Rob.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Not very okay with Teams, so I've got a couple of. I'm glad Joe introduced the concept of a half comment, half question, because I think this is what these will turn out to be. But the first one's about the role of the kind of perceived fairness, because I think two variables are getting conflated here. One is being annoyed at losing, and the other, which I think is the more important story of US elections recently, is thinking that you've lost unfairly, Democrats in 2016 and Republicans in 2020. Now, I'm sure some people have worked up some indignation about some aspects of the rules in 2022, but broadly speaking, I bet that both sides, partly because they did win one of the houses, were less kind of fired up by that we was robbed kind of feeling about this election. So I'd be interested in your views on what role that might play in the Knoll findings. The second one, which is, I suppose, related, was a bit inspired by Dan's point about trying to find people who do respond. And what that made me think is that I think that will be difficult, because I think the kind of people who would respond already have, and this, I'm basically talking about pre-treatment here. People are so thoroughly pre-treated in this kind of environment. So the kind of big question that I want to ask, which is totally unfair to ask any individual really, is, I really felt this when reading the Brookman et al. Paper. Like, we just seem to be in a position now where there's so much pre-treatment and correlational stuff going on that you can't trust correlations. We can't trust non-causal stuff, but we can't do experiments because everyone's been too thoroughly pre-treated anyway. So I'm not sure where that leaves us in this kind of field. I find it very, very hard to believe that the kind of stuff you're talking about doesn't have effects. That your independent and dependent variables aren't linked in the real world, but I don't know how to go about demonstrating it convincingly.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. These are two excellent questions. On the perceived fairness, I don't think we did ask a question about this. We do have like a kind of sort of, was the last presidential election sort of stolen question for Republicans? And I think in our kind of wave 1 survey, the numbers for that are very similar to kind of current or ANES surveys at the time. But yeah, that would have been great to include. I agree with you. And I think you're right also, because I think there's two things potentially going on, right? Because the US midterms were like a more ambivalent, like more complex result, generally emotions might have been a little bit more tempered than during a presidential election, where it's so clear that your side lost or won, that it generates these really strong kind of emotional reactions. And here it's a little bit more muddled. It's more like, oh yeah, well, we kind of lost, but also won something. So that might be one thing that's going on, and you're right, it might also impact kind of fairness perceptions. Although I think, for instance, with the kind of Senate races and the fact that the Senate kind of was won in the end by Democrats, there was still stories going on by Republicans that, that's unfair. And so I think there's also, you can probably hold these two thoughts in your mind at one time as a Republican partisan, for instance, that you think that particular contest was fair, but the other one was not, right? In order to kind of feel better about that result. But that would be great to include in future research. I completely agree with you. And on the pre-treatment effects, of course, you're absolutely right. People come pre-treated. I was actually really happy that we were able to move people at all on these kind of emotion questions. So I consider that a relative success. I wasn't sure if that was enough to make people feel more negative about the election outcome. But you're right, of course. I think what it means for experimental research on this topic generally is that we need really strong treatments, larger sample sizes, and ideally repeated treatments, right, in order to kind of isolate these causal effects. I think it's still worthwhile doing, even if people come in massively pre-treated, because we often care about kind of looking at what like a real world event primed does to our respondents. But I think the kind of designs that we need to do that well are going to have to change or update based on previous survey experiments. I think survey experiments that we often use are kind of based on really large framing or priming effects. And I think in reality, in this environment now, they may be small. So the rest of the design needs to change to adapt to that. But I think it's still like a really worthwhile endeavor and kind of worth thinking about how you might be able to engineer kind of repeat exposure treatments or how to increase the treatment intensity. So for instance, for my next experiments, I really want to use video treatments, audio treatments, instead of just text-based treatments, because I think they're closer to kind of how in the real world people are exposed to these kind of negative feelings. And I think they might also come with a higher intensity, which is good when people come pre-treated.
And I presume you have plans to do this for next year's election.
Yes, that would be great.
You're,
So
you're getting plenty of useful comments for the next study.
Exactly.
Yeah,
if any
good.
of you are interested in that, please do get in touch.
Good. Eva Maria.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Katharina, for this talk, and Ben for setting up this seminar. I've got a short remark regarding the interpretation of the findings, also against the background of findings in Germany. I think that it's also good news because you focus on partisans, and they are in a way committed to the democratic competition. And this might also be a reason why you have these null findings, because you don't have those who are already distant towards democratic competition. So you have all these citizens who are, yes, who think that having two parties, one against the other, makes sense. And so they will not go further and become anti-democratic after these news. I think this might be an interpretation. And also one reassuring finding with a colleague, I published a paper at Frontiers on political tolerance, and with the same finding that violence is not something which is accepted, even when people from the other political camp are concerned. So extremist views, okay, but violence, this is something like, yes, a red sign. So this is in the direction of your findings.
Great, thank you so much. That's really useful. I wasn't aware of this, but I'll definitely have a look. That sounds really directly related. Can I ask where that study was conducted, the one you just talked about? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, I think.
Yes, so I can send you a link, but the study was conducted in Germany.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you're right. On the one hand, we might expect that, kind of committed partisans, the thing that sustains them is being able to engage in this democratic competition. But then I guess there's also all this new work, by Nathan Campbell, Liliana Mason, Samara Klar from the US, showing that particularly in the US context, very committed partisans, highly effectively polarized partisans, are kind of willing to sort of slowly move away from these democratic principles of fair competition in order for their side to win. So sort of there's a kind of, I think you're right, there's a sort of sweet spot. If you're completely not interested in politics, if you don't feel strongly attached to any political party, you're probably less likely to engage, and you're less likely to see political competition as something that's interesting and relevant for you at all. But if it kind of goes too far down the other extreme, maybe some of which we're seeing in the US, then people also come to espouse these really quite extreme and harmful views for democracy. And I guess it's trying to think about how we bring those people back, but also how we still kind of, generate enough competition that people are not apathetic and engaged.
Lovely. Other questions? Can I ask one? It somewhat builds on that, and the second bit of Rob's question, because I don't know this literature very well. I know of it, but I don't know it in detail. And so my question, Katharina, was just, I mean, if I was a policymaker and I was vaguely aware that there was this claim that effective polarization leads to people weakening their democratic norms and potentially tolerating political violence. And I wanted to understand your slide where you said, well, there are competing findings. Why do you think the findings are divergent? I mean, what is, if you were going to kind of summarize, what's the relationship between, on the one hand, this effective polarization, which is clearly happening more so in the US and in other countries, but nonetheless in Britain to a certain extent, and presumably in some European countries as well, on the one hand, and people's commitment to democracy and democratic norms on the other? Why are we getting divergent findings? And is there some explanation for why people are getting different results?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the kind of idea is that in lots of the work that is observational, there might be some other kind of unobserved confounder that is explaining both effective polarization and support for political violence, for instance. So something that gets mentioned a lot under like kind of political violence studies is trait aggression, which is more like an individual level, quite stable disposition, right? So the idea is that these types of individuals, perhaps a kind of very polarized political climate, generally allows them to translate this underlying disposition that they have into this increased support for political violence. If this context didn't exist, perhaps they would, choose to and sort of support violence or engage in violence in other realms, right, of their life, not necessarily politics. So I think it's very much about this interaction between kind of individual level dispositions that people kind of carry with them, but then also a context which kind of activates that and allows that to come forward, right? And so I think for policymakers in particular, there's more and more research now showing that what politicians say, what elites say in terms of political outgroups, the tone they take, how much they work with them, how much they compromise with them, matters massively for voters' levels of effective polarization. So I think political elites in particular have or should have a real incentive to think carefully about how they talk about political outgroups and kind of avoid those spiraling levels of polarization.
Lovely, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Katharina, any questions from you? Anything you're puzzled by? I can't remember the couple of questions you asked at the end, but anything that you'd welcome particular feedback on?
Yeah, I think just kind of, sort of thinking together for the future about, how we prime like emotions and experiments is something I'm really like keen to sort of work on more, to discuss, I guess, with all of you or anyone who's willing to talk about this. One thing we found a lot is that, we think about like kind of anger and anxiety as these really like distinct emotions. which they are, but often they co-occur also in our sample, for instance, right? So people feel like a multitude of like negative feelings, even when we try to prime them about one particular emotion. So I think I'm really interested in developing good emotion treatments more in the future and thinking about how these sort of interact.
Presumably some of our psychology colleagues have done a lot of work on this. I don't know what the current kind of de rigueur thinking on these type of things is, but I agree that's going to be very important. And presumably you have plans for next year for maybe a repeat study.
Yes, that would be
year?
great. Yeah, I think you'd really like try to focus down on more like specific emotions and kind of disentangle this kind of information from like emotion treatments a little bit more than we've done in this study, for instance. I'm also really interested in kind of how signals from like, let's say your fellow in group about what emotions you should be feeling affect how you are feeling yourself rather than just an external stimulus. So learning the news that you're going to lose versus other people saying that they feel really upset about losing. What does that do to how you're feeling and what effects does that have on political attitudes?
Rob?
I mean, I haven't really thought this through, but your specific question about the emotions, I mean, I guess now I think about it, I think of anger as a kind of post-election emotion and worry as a pre-election emotion. Is there any mileage for using the upcoming elections to do something more along those lines?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because you think anxiety is more about the future, kind of forward looking, like about what may or may not happen, or
yeah, and I guess there will be some people who are genuinely worried about the post-election future because they now think this policy or whatever will go on. But it feels more in the spirit of this kind of research that it is worry about what will happen in the election. So if you're able to do a pre and a post again.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
One of the reasons the emotions behave similarly is that pre-election worry turns to anger. I'm a bit out of my depth psychologically here, but it definitely feels like something to think about there.
Yeah, before the election we asked people like how they're feeling about their outgroup. So it's like not really like the election itself, but that would have been nice to have. I agree, maybe for next time. But I think it's really interesting to try and think about how these like emotions cascade into other emotions in the future.
Dan?
Yeah, I guess firstly, just to sort of piggyback on Rob's, is that there's also kind of, again, this is also at my depth psychologically, but there's also retrospective and prospective anxiety, where the retrospective generates the anger because you're sort of worried about what happened, where we conned out of it, could we have done things better? And because you can't do much about it or anything, that generates this kind of anger response, whereas prospective anxiety doesn't, but that is basically at the limit of my knowledge of psychology and political psychology especially. But in other potential designs, I mean, I don't really have anything beyond like what you're saying is basically also what I've been thinking, and I think of what most people also think is that kind of trying to generate these things through images or videos and sound that seem a little bit more likely to generate emotional responses than text. But also this in-group or I guess audience costs are kind of also quite important. I know only from the media stuff, the effects of the media, that it's kind of your in-group discussion is what drives, or maybe one thing that drives the effects rather than getting the media message. So it's about what people think about it, what people you see, in-group care about it. And I think, I haven't seen that done, I guess, at least in my stuff. So that'd be quite an interesting way to go about it, is be like, other people like you say they're very angry and want to sort of riot on the Capitol. How does that make you feel? But, yeah.
Lovely. Unless anyone has any burning last minute questions, I think we will leave it there. So thank you everyone for coming along and for what's actually been a really interesting and enlightening discussion. But most of all, thank you, Katharina, for an excellent study, great presentation, really interesting. I hope you got some nice comments back, both for this piece of work and also for hopefully for future studies. Come
Really great,
back.
thank you.
Come back in a year's time or 18 months time. I can't remember what the electoral cycle is, but come back and give us your round 2 results. They would be very interesting.
Sounds great. Thank you
Lovely.
so much.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you, everyone. Thank you very much. And we've got another seminar, I think, hopefully sometime in November or December, but I will let you know about that. But thank you, everyone, for coming
Thank
today.
you.
And most of all, thank you,
you so
Katharina.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.